Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting the scenery of a meadow, and since I want this to be a full scenery, I'm just going to start by masking the sides. I'm going to use my small washi tape that I'm going to clip onto my sketchbook, but you can also use masking tape for this. Once I'm done, I'm going to start sketching out some loose guidelines so I know where certain things end and start. This doesn't have to be accurate, I'm just doing this roughly since I'm going to be painting over the pencil lines anyway. I'm holding the pencil really far back so I can keep the lines loose and very light. By the way, this is the reference image that I was inspired by, but I will be making my own interpretation of it and just taking the basic idea of the layout. Next, let's go over the colors I'll be using. Firstly, this is Vermilion by Holbein, Crimson Lake by Holbein, Sepia by Holbein, Ultramarine Finest by Schmincke, Cerulean Blue by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, and Bulletproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. Okay, so to begin, I'm going to start by dampening the surface evenly. I'm going to start with the sky and I'm using my large flat brush so it's faster to evenly cover the large area. I want to use a lot of water, but I don't want it to puddle up, so for the excess water, I'm just going to spread it down towards the mountains. For the color, I use a really thick consistency of Ultramarine Finest to start at the top, and as you can see, the paint will just spread naturally because of the damp surface. I'm going to continue this down, still on the damp surface, with a bit of Cerulean Blue, which is a little bit lighter. I'm not going to get too accurate around the edges of the trees and such, but I'm just going to leave the color fairly light so I can paint over it later on once everything's completely dry. I do want the top of the sky to be quite vibrant, so I'm going to keep adding more pigment and take advantage of the wet surface, especially around the edges. For the top, I just keep adding more Ultramarine Finest in a very thick consistency, and you can see that the surface is still damp because the paint is just spreading out on its own. I want this to have a lot of pigment, so I will have enough contrast. As I lift a bit of the color for the texture of the clouds, I'm just using rolled up tissue here, and I'm also twisting my wrist to get different textures. If you feel like your tissue have absorbed too much paint, you can always switch or use a different side of the tissue. I want the clouds to look a bit fluffy up top and flat at the bottom, so you'll see me twisting my wrist a bit less for the horizontal lines at the bottom. And I'm also going to add some softer, smaller ones as well. Next, I'm going to add shadows underneath the clouds, and this will just add a bit of volume to them and make them look even more fluffy. For this, I added a touch of sepia into some Ultramarine Finest, and I'm using a very light consistency, just painting this at the bottom of some of the larger clouds. I'm going to paint on tiny areas, so I'm using a light load on my brush to make sure I have enough control as I paint with the tip of my brush. As I'm looking back, I feel like I can exaggerate the contrast even more for the sky and the clouds, so here I'm going to go back in with a thick consistency of Ultramarine Finest to paint in between the clouds. The surface is still a little bit damp, even though it's not as damp as before, and since I'm using a smaller brush this time, it's a bit easier to control where I want the paint to go. Now I feel like there's too much contrast at the top of the sky compared to the bottom, so I'm also going to increase the saturation by using a mix of Ultramarine Finest and Cerulean Blue, but this time I'm using a light to medium consistency, so there's still a gradual change from the top to the bottom of the sky. I'm applying the paint lightly, just using the tip of my brush, and I'm painting horizontally, so I'm not covering the whole area completely flat, and this will suggest some wispy clouds in the back. Next, I'm going to paint the mountains in the background, and for this I'm using a mix of Cerulean Blue and Crimson Lake. I'm starting with a light consistency to create really light values, which will cover most of the mountain, though I still want to leave out a bit of white since I want this to look somewhat snowy. Then I dried everything off with a hairdryer so I can paint on fresh dry paper to create crisper edges for the mountain peaks. For the darker value, I just used the same mixture with added Ultramarine Finest, and I'm using a medium consistency with a medium to a light brush load. So as I'm dragging my brush following the direction of the mountain, some of my brush strokes will leave a little bit of dry brush textures, which will further suggest some snowy textures. I feel like there's a bit too much contrast, especially on the left, so I went back in with a lighter consistency once the previous application is dry, but I'm still going to leave out some white or some base color peeking through. And once I'm done, I'm going to redefine the form of the mountains with darker values, this time with a touch of added sepia in the mix to mute the color slightly. I'm just going to slowly work layer by layer in order to get the value that I like, and I'm also going to make sure everything's balanced before moving on to the next step. As an example here, I feel like there's too much contrast to the light and the dark, so I'm going to darken the lighter area slightly, but I'm still going to leave out some of the base color showing to make it look more textured. Once I'm done, I'm going to move on to paint the greeneries, and for this I'm using a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium, Cerulean Blue, and Ultramarine Finest to create the green that I like. Then I'm going to mute the color by adding sepia and Crimson Lake. I'm mixing a large amount since I have to cover a large area, and on the side I added even more Hansa Yellow Medium since the greeneries are quite warm and yellow in some areas, especially where there are flowers. I'm going to paint section by section, starting with the one on the left here. I started out by evenly dampening the surface, then I pick up a thick to medium consistency of the yellow-green to paint the top, and I feel like the green at the bottom looks a little bit too brown, so I just added some Cerulean Blue to create this muddy green. I like to alternate between those two colors, and as I get towards the bottom corner, I'm going to darken it further by adding more sepia into the mix again to create a really dark muddy green. I am also going to add the almost brown green to the side of the grass along the pathway, still working on the damp surface in order to give a bit of height to the grass area. Once I'm done with the base color, I'm going to dry it off completely with a hairdryer before moving on to the next section at the back. This time I'm not going to dampen the surface since the area is fairly small and I want the edges to look cleaner. I started with the yellow-green at the top using a medium to thick consistency, and as I get towards the bottom I use the darker green to separate it from the foreground. The area on the right is the largest, so I'm going to dampen just the top part. I can see a lot of flowers in the reference, so I'm going to use a deep yellow mix this time from Hansa Yellow and a little bit of Vermilion. I'm going to spread and dot it in random areas at the top of the section. And I like to fill in the rest of the space in between the deep yellow with some of the yellow-green mixtures. Again, alternating the color with some of the muddy green as well. As I get towards the bottom, I'm going to add more of the muddy green, and just like the other side, I'll slowly add in some of the darker muted value as well by adding a bit more sepia in the mix. Notice how I'm applying the paint like I'm painting tall grass textures. I'm directing the lines upwards even though the colors will just blend with each other, but if there are any streaks, it will help with creating the subtle grass textures as the base color. While the surface is still damp, I also like to add extra streaks for the texture with thicker consistency of the dark green. Because of the color variation and the value change, the field has a bit of depth and layers instead of everything looking flat. And once I'm done, I'm going to dry everything off before painting on the walkway. For the base color, I'm going to use sepia as the main brown with added vermilion and Hansa Yellow to lighten and give a bit more saturation or brightness to the brown. I'm using a very heavy load and a medium consistency to paint the base color, and I like to create the strokes horizontally to make the ground look like it's flat compared to the field of green. And while the surface is still damp, I like to also add on some darker values using the same color in a thicker consistency, especially on the left side where you can see a bit of cast shadow from the tall grass. I feel like the hill at the back looks a little bit too bright compared to everything else, and I want it to blend more into the background, so I use some of the dark and muted purple color from the mountain in a really light consistency to add some texture and to also push the field a little bit further back in the painting. Next, I'm going to add on the pine trees using the same green mix, but this time it has more sepia, so the green is slightly darker and a little bit more earthy instead of the bright green from the grass. And I've switched to my Chinese calligraphy brush to make it a bit easier to create uneven edges for the pine trees. Of course, you can use regular brush for this, but I just like the randomized textures this brush creates since the bristles are very floppy and uncontrollable. And honestly, I've just been trying to find a time and place to use this brush a bit more often since I don't get to paint landscapes too much. This brush was gifted to me years ago and I don't really know the brand, but I think if you use any really floppy brush, you can come up with similar textures if that's what you're going for. For the color, I'm using a medium to thick consistency so it can stand against the base colors of the mountain as well as the field. And I also like to play with the size and placement of the pine trees to give more depth in the composition. I'm not really looking at the reference image, I'm just trying to fit things into the composition that I have right in front of me. I feel like the composition is a little bit too heavy on the right for now because of the large pine tree. So I'm going to add a few medium-sized ones on the left so it doesn't look too symmetrical on the right and left, but I feel like this adds a little bit more of a natural balance in the composition. After this, I'm going to switch to my medium-sized synthetic brush and I'm going to use the same green mixture in a thicker consistency to add some shadows, which in turn will add some form to the pine trees and add a bit more detail. Here I'm using my synthetic brush because I want the snappiness of the bristles so I can have a bit more control where I place these shadows. For the textures, I like to create randomized brush strokes which follows the overall silhouette of the tree, but I'm still going to leave out some base colors so the tree doesn't look too dense. The more negative space you leave, the lighter the tree will look, and I like to place the shadow on the right hand side to follow the light source coming from the left, just like the cast shadow we added on the pathway. I like to create the textures by wiggling my brush ever so slightly in different directions. Sometimes it goes up, down, or diagonally, and I like to add less and less shadows as I get to the left side, so there isn't an abrupt change from the light base color to the dark shadow. For the smaller trees in the background, I try to use a slightly lighter consistency so they don't stand out as much as the pine trees in front. Once I'm done with the pine trees, I'm going to add some height to the grass area. I'm just using the same green, but this just has less sepia in the mixture, so the color is a little bit more saturated and bright. And I'm going to individually paint those single strokes as some tall grass textures, especially on the right hand side, since it will be visible to us. I like to think of this as a three-dimensional structure that is slightly taller than the pathway, so you can see a little bit of height where the shadow is on the right hand side, and the top is more or less flat but textured with the grass. And for the top area, since the light is shining above it, I want to keep it much brighter compared to the areas on the sides. And to add on the textures, I use the same green with more Hansa yellow medium in the mix, but I'm using a light consistency, so the color is fairly transparent. So those textures stay subtle and it won't take away from the details that we're going to paint on top of the grass textures, which are the flowers. After this, I'm going to add more of the cast shadow. I'm adding this dark brown from Sepia Ultramarine Finest and Crimson Lake. And I'm placing this really thick consistency right under some of the tall grass. And I'm going to use a lighter consistency to paint the cast shadow horizontally on the pathway, just like we did before, but this time on the dry surface, so the edges of the brush strokes are much sharper and it looks more textured and detailed. Now moving on to the right section of the field, I'm going to again add some subtle grass textures on top in a light consistency, so the textures will dry transparent and subtle. And on the left side where the grass ends, I'm going to also give it a bit of height just like we did on the left side, but this time I'm using a light consistency because the side is facing the light source and it shouldn't be as dark as the left side. I can start to see a bit of a subtle height on this right field. So next I'm going to add on the flower details. I'm going to use a thick consistency of bleed proof white to add some flowers. You can color on top of this or leave it white depending on the color combination you want the flowers to have. I'm just painting really tiny flowers following the direction of the grass because some of the grass textures should act like the stem of some of these flowers. And you can also play with different shapes for the flowers as well. Here I'm adding some tall flowers taking inspiration from the reference image, but I'm just somewhat simplifying the shapes, just trying to get the basic idea of the shapes without going into too much detail. If you can think of any other flower types, you can also add it on depending on your preference. You can technically paint the colors on top of the field, but I feel like the colors won't be as vibrant compared to if you were to add the white base from the bleed proof white, so you do have the choice. I personally also like a little bit of the white showing through, so the flowers kind of look highlighted in certain areas. And as for these purple flowers, I'm using the same mix as the mountains earlier, but you can play with the ratio if you want the color a bit more pinkish or a bit more bluish. I'm going to add a bit more at the back, but I'm not going to make it as dense as the ones that we just painted. And as for the ones in front, I'm going to treat it as a foreground, so I added a bit more detail to those flowers as well by adding a darker or a thicker consistency of the same color on the right hand side for a little bit more volume on these flowers and shadow, just like how we painted the trees earlier. For the same type of flowers at the back, you can see I'm also using a lighter consistency of more or less the same mixture. This is so these flowers look a little bit more subtle and not as detailed as the ones in the foreground. I'm going to go ahead and paint more simple flowers with around 5 to 7 petals. I'm just painting these in between the ones I've painted so far, and I'm going to turn these ones pink, so I added a bit of vermilion into the bleed proof white, so the pink is nice and pastel. I'm also going to add orange flowers after this, and I'm not going to add the white base because I feel like I can use a thick enough consistency for the color to stand out on top of the light grass with a mix of vermilion and Hansa yellow. At the back, I'm also going to add some tall yellow flowers, just like in the reference image. I'm using the same mixture here from Vermilion and Hansa yellow, but you can see it has much more Hansa yellow, so the color is more like a deep yellow instead of a thick orange. And with a thicker consistency of the same mix, I'm going to dot the center of the white flowers I painted first, and also use a dark brown or dark purple to paint the center of the pink flowers. After this, I'm just going to add some random white dots to suggest some smaller flowers in between the ones I've painted so far. I feel like I have enough flowers, so next I'm going to add some stems to the flowers in front and also add more grass textures. I want the flowers to stand out compared to the grass, so I make sure to use a light consistency and a dry brush load to make sure that the stems are nice and thin. I'm going to add some light grass as well as some darker ones. This will again add a little bit more depth into the composition, so there are layers to the field. I'm going to add similar flowers on the left side. This time I'm starting with the yellow flowers, just painting it very loosely. But as I get towards the foreground, I notice that the base green is much darker compared to the right hand side, or the field on the right hand side. So after this, I decided to use the white base again from the bleed proof white, just to make the colors pop further, especially for the flowers in the foreground. This time, since the grass is quite dark at the corner, I'm going to use a thin consistency of bleed proof white to paint on some thin stems on the dark background. I'm using a dry brush load so I can create these really delicate lines, or you can also switch to a smaller brush to paint it on. On the lighter areas, I'm also going to add some darker green for added leaves or added grass. Lastly, I'm going to extend some of the cast shadow from the tall grass, since I feel like the shadows have lightened a little bit too much, so I'm just going to extend it and darken some areas. And I'm also going to darken some parts of the field on the right hand side. For the leaves, I'm just going to paint in between some of the flowers, since I feel like after adding on the flowers, the field starts to look a bit too flat again. So here I'm trying to break the flatness by dividing it up into a bit more layers. Here I'm just adding on a medium to thin consistency of the previous green mixture and painting in between some of the flowers. Once everything is balanced, I'm going to unmask the sides and reveal the painting. And this is the finished look. I'm quite happy with the vibrant colors on this one, and I'm starting to enjoy painting these scenic landscapes a bit more. If you enjoyed this tutorial and learned something new, please consider subscribing for more. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!